Our final keynote speaker for today is Dick Ravitch. Dick's been the CEO of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York. He's a former lieutenant governor. He's a constant advisor on affordable housing in New York, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. He's chaired the New York State Urban Development Corporation and was instrumental in resolving New York City's fiscal crisis in the 1970s. He's an author, a speaker on government finance, housing, and government structures, and highly sought after. And he's probably the single most go-to advisor and thought leader on state and local government bonds and pensions and finances, and most other issues related to financial management. So we're delighted that Dick is spending the morning with us, and welcome.
I'm going to grab a bottle of water here. It's a particular pleasure to be here because if I told you how little educational opportunity there is in the major universities in the United States of America to learn how cities work, how cities get financed, you would be shocked. The three most august institutions in my part of the world have almost no academic program to educate or create an opportunity for their students to learn. So when you have a university like the University of Illinois and a leader like Mike, who is willing to take this issue on in a serious manner, it is highly commendable, and all of us who are interested in the subject have an obligation to help in any way we can. I want to begin with a little history. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. 41 years ago, the President of the United States issued a paper called "This is the Urban Policy of the United States of America." And I reread it recently. It's the biggest bunch of nonsense that I've ever read in my life. It has absolutely no relevance whatsoever to any issue that any municipal or state government confronts today. I don't mean it wasn't well-meaning. Actually, it was written by a dear friend of mine who's about to go become a member of Congress, Donna Shalala. But when you think about it for a minute, you realize how the issues that those of us concerned with state and local government have to address were almost not relevant then. New York, however, had gone through a fiscal crisis, and I want to tell you that story very briefly. I want to tell you three brief stories of historical value. In 1966, the mayor of the city of New York went to the governor of the state of New York and said, "We need more state aid." The governor said, "Sorry, Buster, I don't have no money to give you, but I'm going to make it easier for you to borrow." And he amended the municipal finance law of the state of New York to permit the city to issue short-term paper, revenue anticipation notes, and bond anticipation notes in amounts that the mayor estimated he would be receiving in the subsequent fiscal year in the form of revenue and taxes. The law up till then had said that the city could not borrow more of this kind of borrowing that exceeded what it had actually received the prior year in taxes and revenues, revenues being payments from the federal and state governments. Over the next 8 years, the city of New York borrowed over $6 billion in the form of tax and revenue anticipation notes. And because of another failure of the New York State Urban Development Corporation, the banks told Governor Carey, and I was the only other person in the room on May 2nd, 1975, that they would no longer underwrite the notes and bonds of the city of New York, because they had suddenly become aware of the fact that the city had accrued a level of debt that there was no way in a realistic world, in a realistic projection of tax revenue, that they would be able to pay that back. They didn't think through all the implications or ramifications of shutting off the credit to the city. They sort of made this announcement, walked out of the room. The governor and I looked at each other, and he had a good sense of humor and a foul mouth, but I'm not going to repeat what he said. The truth of the matter is that we solved that problem by doing what the city of Chicago just imitated fairly recently. We took the sales tax away from the city of New York by a state law, made it payable to a new entity, and issued debt against that entity. The banks initially were highly reluctant to lend against that. I remember the chairman of Citibank was a brilliant man, a little to the right of Attila the Hun, but nonetheless very brilliant. I remember him saying to me, "You expect me to buy a bond secured by a revenue that I had every right to believe I had a security interest in when I bought the general obligation debt of the city of New York or underwrote it?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I do expect you to. Because if you don't, sorry, we're going to file a bankruptcy petition." We came within 3 hours of filing a bankruptcy petition on October 16, 1975. And I'm not going to tell you that whole story now, because that's not the gravamen of what I want to talk about. The problem got solved. Problem got solved primarily because the federal government stepped in with a multi-billion-dollar line of credit at a very cheap interest rate, 100 basis points over the Treasury's cost of borrowing. And they didn't do it so much for the people of the city of New York. They did it because the financial system around the world was threatened, because the banks, the major banks in New York, had very, very substantial holdings in New York City debt, and it was in serious jeopardy of default. As I said, we came literally within 3 hours of filing a bankruptcy petition. Now, the next story I want to tell you, 2010, I'm lieutenant governor, and the budget director of the state of New York comes to me and he says, "Dick, I want to show you a draft budget that we're going to be submitting to the legislature. And get your reaction before I show it to the governor." So I took it home and I read it. I couldn't believe what I read. It said that they were going to make a $1.5 billion contribution to the state pension fund in the form of promissory notes. And those promissory notes were going to bear an interest rate of 3.5%. And when you check the documents of the pension system, they were using a 7.5% discount rate to measure the adequacy of the pension fund. So I sort of laughed. I said, "You can't be serious." And he's deadly serious. "We can't afford to do more." I said, "Oh my God." I called the president of the state AFL-CIO. I said, "Do you know what they're up to?" He says, "It's your administration." I said, "I know, but I'm talking to you as a friend." He said, "Yeah, they told me that if I didn't stay quiet about it, they would have to lay off 10,000 people." I could embellish all of this, but to tell you it passed. It had the strong editorial endorsement of the New York Times, but it passed the legislature, and the trustee, sole trustee of the pension system, strongly endorsed it. I couldn't believe it. I never saw something so patently silly in my entire life. Now, next story. I really got interested in pension accounting, and I started reading about it. And one day I'm reading a cease and desist order issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission against the state of New Jersey for failing to disclose in their borrowing prospectus the underfunding of their pension system. And this describes starting 15 years earlier, Governor Whitman had failed to contribute the money that had been actuarially determined should be contributed to the pension fund. And no governor since then had made the actuarially required contribution. By sheer serendipity, I was at a dinner party that night, and lo and behold, there is the current governor of New Jersey, who I happen to know. He had been a banker beforehand. I'd had some business dealings with him. Lovely, honest, honorable guy. And I said to him, I was reading about you today. He said, what about? I said, I read you didn't make the contributions you were supposed to make to the pension fund. And he says, damn it, Dick, you don't understand. The tax base in New Jersey can't possibly sustain the level of contribution necessary to make the pension system whole. And I said, well, I understand that that's a serious problem, so what's going to happen? He said, the feds are going to bail us out. And I laughed and I said, I won't tell you literally what I said. Well, I told him I didn't think that was a realistic projection. And finally, the hostess at this dinner party told us both to shut up, which was appropriate under the circumstances. Now, I want to talk seriously for a minute, because I have watched a number of people in this room. I've had the good fortune of having known Richard and Catherine and worked with them through the Vocal Alliance over the years of my friend Jim Spiotto, of watching Larry Massal fight the good fight for a long time, and I'm sure if I would recognize other faces in the room as well. But I want to say a few things. I think this problem is getting worse. And the number of jurisdictions afflicted with this squeeze, for the lack of a better expression, are increasing. And let me tell you why. And by the way, this is not just conjecture on my part. Moody's just issued a report making it very clear that pension contributions and OPEB contributions are adding significantly to, are growing at a significant rate. And absent some fairy godmother solution, it is reducing the amount of money that cities and states have to spend on everything else. Everything else being infrastructure, healthcare, services. Do politicians care about this? Yes. Are they willing to take politically suicidal steps in order to solve it? No. The new governor of New Jersey just announced last week that he was going to do things that he roundly criticized his predecessor for. The candidates for governor of Connecticut are criticized Dan Malloy. I've talked to one of them at least. They're going to do exactly the same thing. If you could kick the can down the road in our political system, you're going to do it. I haven't met the person who's got the guts not to and tell the public the unvarnished truth. 5 years ago, Gatsby made an effort to address this problem in a somewhat serious fashion, and they promulgated a rule that would have required states and cities to publish in their CAFRs 4-year projections, budget projections. The chairman of Gatsby asked me to testify in favor of it, which I was delighted to do. I was followed by the head of NASBO, National Association of State Budget Officers, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National Governors Association. They all testified against it. At the cocktail hour shortly thereafter, I said to these guys who I knew, I said, fellas, what's going on? And you know what their answer was? Come on, Dick. You know our constituents have no interest in more transparency. Now, why does it concern me? I mean, does it concern me because I wish our politicians were a little gutsier? Of course. But it concerns me because I see serious decline in the public infrastructure. I see an extraordinary increase in the cost of public higher education. It's a hell of a university to say this at. There are 3 students in public universities for every one in a private university. Their tuition has gone up 3.5 times in the last 15 years, faster than the tuition in any private university. That means that's a function not just of inflation, it's a function of relative diminishing subsidy by state governments. States and cities are under enormous pressure to meet contractual and constitutionally obligated expenditures. It's very difficult, and I understand why, to figure out how to avoid them or modify them. As we know, I'm sorry the flight was delayed, so I didn't get the benefit of hearing what some of the speakers this morning said, but the truth of the matter is that cities in 30 of the 50 states at least have the constitutional authority to file bankruptcy and go through a bankruptcy process in which obligations can be adjusted and modified. But it doesn't really address the problem that states have. Or if you have multiple jurisdictions within a state that have fiscal problems that align with one another, which reduces a state's ability to temporarily assist one jurisdiction as against another. Then you have places, for example, in Nassau County, New York State, which has the constitutional authority to file bankruptcy, but there was a statute passed that said if they filed, they nonetheless could not default on any debt obligation. In other words, you could modify your pension benefits, you could fire all your cops or cut their salaries, but you couldn't touch your debt. So that was an amendment to a statute that otherwise was outrageous. And you hear today people saying, well, we have to preserve a bond market. And the bond market depends on the confidence that people have in the integrity and fiscal well-being of our states and cities. It's a $4 trillion market. There are millions of widows and orphans dependent on the income from these portfolios in order to eat and pay rent. You can't abrogate or modify those obligations. But what about the guy who buys a bond in Puerto Rico? I don't know whether Anna's still here. a guy who buys a bond in Puerto Rico when it is demonstrably clear that they have a several billion-dollar deficit, that they did things to subvert the constitutional protections that were instituted in order to try to bring some degree of fiscal integrity into the process. And the people that bought that debt, they lent money. They lent money to non-credit-worthy borrowers who ultimately reached the point where they said, hey, I don't know how we can pay our money creditors, our pension beneficiaries, but nobody is there screaming about infrastructure because depreciation is not an expense under government accounting rules. So there is no way of measuring the extent to which the physical infrastructure, our schools, our parks, our streets, our roads, are diminishing in quality. And somebody said earlier about privatization. I mean, if you were the mayor of any city in this country and you had to build a school or buy a bus, why would you finance something taxable if you could finance it tax exempt? So the interest cost is part of your budget. It's utter nonsense to think that essential public facilities are better off being financed in a taxable market as against a tax-exempt market. What I'm trying to say, and I'm sorry for skipping around, is that I think the problem that I have described and that you are here to hear others talk about is going to get one hell of a lot worse. I'm not making any political predictions. I'm not capable of being a good prognosticator about politics. And I will try to hide my intensely partisan feeling about the current administration in Washington. But I will tell you very simply that given the size of the federal deficit, given the enormous pressure to prevent that from growing, that deficit from growing, given the pressure to reduce the federal subsidization of healthcare, given the condition of so many activities that have, rightly or wrongly, but nonetheless been dependent on an infusion of federal dollars, to predict that the discretionary budget of the federal government is going to do anything but shrink in the foreseeable future would be irresponsible as hell. And at the same time, if you recognize or look at the charts, and Moody's has printed some of them, at the unfunded pension liabilities and the unfunded OPEB liabilities, and you see how they're growing. And courts and politicians are saying to people elected to state and local office, pay your bills. What is going to happen to all of the discretionary things that government does? We could go back to square one and argue that maybe they shouldn't be financed by governments. But in a state like Illinois or New York or California, that is absolutely silly to suggest that the political climate would ever permit a significant reduction in discretionary spending for social programs, health care, housing for poor people, homeless housing issues. It isn't going to happen. What is lacking, and I'm sorry if I've talked too long, but what is lacking is an awareness of how serious this problem is and how critically important it is to get the people in politics to acknowledge it, to tell the truth about it to the public, to say, we have a serious problem in this country on retirement. It's not just that our pension systems are on the whole not adequately funded. It's also true that with the declining birth rate, there are people who make a very cogent argument that the Social Security system is not adequately funded. And people are living longer. So when you talk about modifying pensions, and it makes a lot of sense for local officials to try to do that, like converting a portion of the payment into a defined contribution plan as against a defined benefit. But you have to ask yourself, is the net income that the elderly person going to ultimately receive enough for them to eat and have a roof over their head and get adequate medical care? Those are questions that are going to come with increasing frequency as you try to address the cost by reducing benefits. I'm not saying there's a clear answer to this, but I am saying that we need the universities, the thoughtful people in this society, the media, to address these problems with a level of gravitas that doesn't exist in very many places. I'm pleased that it exists here, and I apologize if I talked too long.
Hi, Bill Bergman with Truth in Accounting. Why do you think GASB chose not to account for depreciation? Do you think there's any creative or productive ways that that could be addressed?
You know, that's a very good question. The members of GASB are essentially selected by governors. Governors don't want pressure to raise taxes or to have to treat depreciation as an expense that they have to budget for. There is a very, very interesting question which has some actual current relevance as to how the members of the board of the Government Accounting Standards Board are selected. And if they were selected by the dean of your School of Urban Affairs, we'd get a hell of a better result. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Amanda Cass. I'm with the new center here at UAC, the Government Finance Research Center, that's Dean Pagano's the director of. And you mentioned that people aren't educated enough on fiscal issues, and so I'd love to hear about what you think this new center can do to help educate the general public and help educate people beyond our students here at UIC.
Well, I'm embarrassed to tell you I don't know enough about the specific program that's instituted here. But as I said earlier, I happen to teach a course in municipal bankruptcy at Yale Law School, but it's the only place, it's the only course in the entire curriculum at Yale University in which people address this. If you asked, and I don't know whether Heather Gillers is still here. Are you still here, Heather? Well, she's an example of one of a handful of journalists who understands these issues and writes about it coherently and accurately. She did a series, I didn't even know her at the time, on the Chicago school system that was actually eye-opening, first rate. But if you go around this country, I respectfully suggest to you that 90% of the journalists have no idea the difference between a bun and a balloon. And they don't know how to write about this or how to make these fiscal and financial and legal questions relevant to the everyday person who worries about essential services and life itself. So I think educating journalists, making sure there is some place in the curriculum of every college student. You don't have to become an expert in urban affairs or an expert in municipal bankruptcy, but you should, in the world that we live in today, not be able to complete a college education without becoming aware of, in its broadest dimension, of the seriousness and urgency of this set of issues.
I have a question here. I'm Steve Schlickman, former executive director of the Urban Transportation Center here at the university, and also former executive director of the RTA here in Chicago. And we have a $19 billion backlog for our transit system. If we don't increase spending to address that and our needs going forward, in 10 years it will be $30 billion.
You'll catch up with New York.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm concerned about, and that gets to my question to you, because back in the 80s, when you were the chairman of the MTA and a distinguished business leader at the same time, you helped address their serious capital problem then, and did so resulting in a very successful decades of investment into that system that turned it around. Unfortunately, they've uncovered new problems that are plaguing the system again, but what lesson learned from that experience in the 80s?
There's a very simple lesson. What I did in the 80s, and I did it again in 2008, I went to the business community. And I gave them a list of potential taxes: payroll tax, surcharge on the sales tax, gas tax, wholesale fuel tax, high rate income tax. So which of these taxes would have the least adverse impact on the economy? And they groaned and they struggled and blah, blah, but they answered the question. And David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase, Dick Shin, the chairman of MetLife, Bill Ellinghaus, the chairman of AT&T, went to Albany, capital of New York State, spoke to the Republicans who control the state Senate, and said the business community can't survive without a functioning subway system. Give Ravitch his tax package, and the Republicans voted for it. But it had the support of the business community. Today, and certainly in New York, the business community is totally passive. They're against taxes. I remember sitting with your former governor and Rahm talking about the fiscal problem when Rauner announced he was going to cut the income tax from 5 to 3. I said, what insanity, given the revenue needs. And I don't know the particulars of Illinois. But the entire business community has poured billions upon billions of dollars into politics to avoid increases in taxes that, even when they are addressed and their use is specific to address specific public needs. So I'm being very blunt. I think it's a failure of a level of civic engagement and civil responsibility on the part of the business community in the United States that is contributing significantly to this spiral that I talked about and that has been the subject of this meeting. One more question.
Bob Trinka, UIC. There's been a lot of realistic and unfortunately very negative discussions this morning. I was hoping we could end on a positive note, is that among the 50 states and the 3,000 or so municipalities, there must be some that are doing something right in regard to the concerns that you and others have expressed. Are there any lessons we could take from those? Could you identify some of those states or municipalities? And more importantly, are there lessons to be learned moving forward in light of the concerns that you raised?
I wish I could point to successes. There have been efforts and relative successes in places. There are places, there's one thing I failed to mention, which I think may be gaining a little traction. In 1975, when we created the special purpose borrowing entity, or secured by the sales tax, we did something else. We put into the law a requirement that the city of New York had to budget in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, which meant that they had to budget on an accrual basis, not on a cash basis. And if I could take 2 more minutes to put this in historic context for you, remember, there was no collective bargaining for public employees until the early 60s. And that was the period of the Great Society and the Civil Rights Movement, an explosion in the number of activities that city and state governments engaged in. And there was a tripling of the workforce as the unions gained enormous leverage in the political process. When the recession hit in the 70s, and politicians said to the unions, sorry, Buster, we don't have the cash to pay you significant increases in wages, but I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll give you retirement benefits. And those retirement benefits, because they didn't involve the outlay of cash in the year the promise was made, they weren't budgeted. More and more people are now beginning to talk about the fact that they have to change their budgeting system. I'll just tell you one more story. In 2014, I'm sorry, I missed her. I haven't met her yet. The young budget director for the city of New York was here this morning. I don't know what she said, but I could tell you that in 2014, this city controller called me on a Sunday morning to say that his staff advised him that de Blasio's draft budget did not conform to GAAP because he had agreed to make payments to teachers in years 2, 3, and 4 to cover back pay that hadn't been paid because Bloomberg hadn't given the teachers a contract for 5 years. And the controller's GAAP experts said, you know, those obligations to pay cash in years 2, 3, and 4, they should be counted against this year's budget. And I went over it very carefully, and I said, you're absolutely right. And de Blasio, it never made the press, de Blasio was forced to add $800 million to his budget in order for the city to budget in a way compliant with GAAP. That is, if that system were adopted, and even if there was a transition period for its adoption, it would make it very, very difficult for cities and states to continue to screw around. You want to know an even harsher remedy, which I have advocated, and that is federal government passes a law that says unless within 3 years or 5 years you are budgeting on an accrual basis, you lose your ability to issue tax-exempt debt. Because the lack of connectivity between what happens in the budget process in Washington and what happens in the state and local government is staggering. The average congressman, you know, I remember that during the 2009, 2010, the Democrats, congressmen from New York, were saying to me, this is all informally, and I knew most of them pretty well, they said, come on, Dick, don't put more pressure on us to increase spending under the National Education Act. Why should we keep putting ourselves on the line here and getting attacked by our conservative opponents while you guys in Albany are getting away scot-free? I said, well, let me ask you a question. Supposing the governor to cut the education budget, and every school district was forced to fire 10 people. Would that affect you politically? They said, hell no, as long as we continue to vote for the appropriations under the National Education Act. And that little story, which is a true one, exemplifies the issue here. There is a total disconnect between the budget process in Washington and what happens at the state and local level. And until the President of the United States and the people who run OMB and CBO, etc. A friend of mine, a congressman, put in an amendment on the floor. He didn't expect it to go anywhere, and he was laughed at when he did it, but he said that every time CBO is required to score the cost of any budget proposal made at the federal level, he said they should be required to score the impact on state governments of those budget proposals. Well, I mean, he introduced it on the floor with no real expectation, and he was absolutely, people made fun of him. As if, why should the federal government care what impact there is on state and local governments? Now think about that in this context that we're talking about today. Anyway, I've talked too long. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dick. There was something positive that came out of this, I think, something uplifting. The other was that we shouldn't believe in fairy godmother solutions, I think was the one thing. Thanks to the numerous people, this is the end. Thanks to many people who made this event possible, the committee, Jenny Sweeney, Norma Ramos, Brian Flood, Jennifer Woodard, Casey Sabetti, and also Carla Bailey of Jiskolka Terman, and also all of the other people with JT who've been with us today. Special thanks to the white paper authors. They're on the website, so you can take a look at them if you haven't. David Merriman, Yonghong Wu, Shu Wang, Michael Siciliano, Jared Carr, Jim Spiato, Rebecca Hendrick, Marty Luby, Gary Strong, and David Souston. Enjoy the lunch, meet, mingle, dream solutions to the vexing challenges, and enjoy. Thank you until next year.